Thank you, Mr. Dugard, for taking the time to do this interview. Today, we're going to discuss your brand new book, Taking London, Winston Churchill and the Fight to Save Civilization. Could you show me the book? Because the book hasn't arrived for me yet.
There's the book.
It's very interesting. I just gave you compliments before the interview, but the way you wrote it, it was just fascinating.
Oh, thanks. The thing I like about the cover, you've got Churchill here, but then you've got all these little airplanes from the Battle of Britain. So it kind of, you got to look closely to get the message.
Before we get into details, could you give the viewers like a broad explanation about what the Battle of Britain is and in what period it happened?
Well, let's go back to the start of World War II, September 1st, 1939. Hitler and Nazi Germany invade Poland. But once they conquer Poland, there's a long period where nothing happens. And the British call it the phony war because technically Europe was at war with Hitler, but nothing was happening. But then in May 1940, 9 months later, he crashes through, he invades France, he invades the Low Countries. Hitler controls Europe. And England is the only nation that stands alone against Hitler. And Hitler is preparing to invade England. That's the next step. And once he invades England, that he effectively has total control over all of Western Europe. And the Battle of Britain was the British defense to Hitler, because Hitler knew that he could not defeat Britain unless he defeated their air force first. This what's special about this, it's the first battle in history to take place completely in the skies. So this was the British fighter pilots versus the German fighter pilots and the German bombers that were coming over to England to bomb the cities. And what's remarkable about it is the British had so few aircraft, and the Germans outnumbered them almost 3-1, and yet the British found a way to persevere and win the fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what you write about it in the beginning of the book too, how the British Empire was obviously super famous for like owning the sea, being very strong, and then suddenly it was kind of like powerless, all those boats.
To this day, the Royal Navy still claims that they were pivotal in controlling the Battle of Britain, but realistically, as we saw later in the war, in the Pacific, even the biggest battleship is not immune to an aerial attack. A bomb or a torpedo can sink a huge ship. So that's why it was so important to control the skies. And the Royal Navy definitely played a part, but the Royal Navy was very vulnerable, and it was really up to the British pilots to win the war.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote a book called Taking Berlin, Taking Paris. Why the choice to write Taking London? Why was that the next choice?
When I started this series, and I wanted to do Taking Paris just because I've always been fascinated by the occupation of Paris and how that came about. And then you have the resistance, you have all these things going on. But as I wrote it, all of a sudden Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle became pivotal characters in that. And then Taking Berlin picks up where Taking Paris ends, after the France's, the Americans come in and liberate Paris. And then, Taking Berlin is about the next phase all the way from that day to the end of the war. But in Churchill's there again. And so as I was thinking about a third book, I kind of kept coming back to Churchill because he's such a great guy to write about. He's such a charismatic figure, a pivotal figure in history. And I've always been fascinated by not just the Battle of Britain, but the Spitfire aircraft and the Hurricane aircraft, which were just marvels. And at first it seemed easy, like, I'm just going to write about the Battle of Britain. Well, it turns out it's not so easy. There's so many moving parts. You have Churchill, you have, Dowding, who's in charge of fighter command. You have the Germans and the German aircraft, the German pilots. And to weave all that together into a single fluid narrative was a lot more work than I expected.
Because you've also picked like 4 big important characters, or well, not necessarily big. Like some of them were also just the regular soldier, kind of the regular pilot, which I really liked, because it showed the stories like from a regular perspective instead of only seeing like Churchill's perspective. Like you really saw what happened on a day-to-day basis of the Battle of Britain.
Whenever you write a book like this, you need to have a single common thread that can carry the story, that is strong enough to carry the story. And in this book, Churchill is that guy. We open the book with Churchill, we close the book with Churchill. We see him throughout the book. I revisit him in his actions and his new relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, American president. So
Yeah.
that allows me to, with that as the strong tent pole for the whole story, that allows me to go back and take, these four pilots that I follow and all these other characters like Edward R. Murrow, who, the American who comes to kind of offer an outsider's perspective. And none of that really makes any sense unless you have a guy like Churchill to support everything.
Yeah, he's a pivotal figure. Have you been to the Churchill War Room? You must, right?
Oh, about 5 or 6 times. I'll tell you what I like about it is they continuously change that exhibit. So whenever I go back, I learn something new, and it's really cool. I mean, nobody should go to London and not go to the Churchill War Rooms.
Yeah, well, I must say, my mom's from London, so I've been like 50 times and I still haven't been. It's,
Gotta go.
yeah, I'm gonna go.
Super cool. Super cool.
So I think to really understand the Battle of Britain, we need to start at before the war. So the landscape, what you describe in your book, is that the sentiment was kind of, some people were on the side of signing a peace agreement with Hitler, and others were like, no, it's impossible. Why did many believe that for some time a peace agreement could be reached with Hitler?
You have to go back to World War I, and it was such a horrible war, and so many men didn't come home, and the loss of life was astounding. So the prevailing attitude throughout Europe was like, no more war. We never want to do that again. And Hitler, on the other hand, he's like a Donald Trump type figure. He's like this charismatic figure who really wants to rise up and empower Nazi Germany, which had been defeated in the war, and everybody was poor, and Hitler gave them, a sense of empowerment. And so even as Hitler began secretly building the Nazi war machine, people in London, for instance, when Winston Churchill was one of the lone people who said, we need to pay attention to this guy. He's a bad guy. He wants war. He wants total war. He's building a war machine. And everybody thought Churchill was a warmonger and he was crazy. And people actually liked Hitler. The British people had an admiration for Hitler. And the world kind of saw him as a little bit of a joke. So nobody was terrified of Hitler. And then, slowly he began to, he went into the Sudetenland. He began picking off these little portions of surrounding countries and, border countries around Germany. But the thing he always said when he did this was, oh, I'm doing this so we can have peace. I'm trying to keep the peace and maintain the peace. And for the longest time, people believed him. The turning point came about, I say 1934, 1935, where he became a very much more ominous individual. But, right up until, even after Hitler invaded Poland, there were people within the British government, Lord Halifax among them, and Chamberlain, who really believed that Hitler wanted peace, that we could maintain peace. And, in the meantime, Hitler is building up the secret book where he's listing all the places in England that troops will be stationed, all the people that will be rounded up and sent to prison camps. And Churchill, of course, is going to be assassinated the minute that Hitler comes in. So, like right up until just before the Battle of Britain, literally, there were still people who were saying we should try to make peace with Hitler because we're never going to beat him.
Yeah, because the way you wrote about what happened in Poland, the invasion in Poland, like I'm European, so I know it happened, but the details of it, and I looked it up on Google, like it's so sad that it isn't discussed more either, because the way they like bombed it, it wasn't even like a clear target, right? It was like hit whatever you want to hit, from schools to hospitals to just elderly homes, whatever.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, and you could imagine too, in those early moments of the war, you're a Polish citizen, you live in a small town, you're just waking up, and next thing you know, you have Stuka Ju-87 dive bombers, coming right out of the sky, screaming down on you, dropping bombs, like you said, on hospitals and churches, and just a staggering loss of life. And when you think about this, when bombings like that happens, it's not neat and surgical. Not everybody dies, but not everybody, remains alive well. You lose arms, you lose legs, your face is cut up by shrapnel. It's a horrible thing.
And what was like the pivotal moment that the UK sentiment mostly went to were not able to sign a peace agreement with Hitler?
Well, that didn't come until like right before the Battle of Britain. That's when Lord Halifax effectively left the government. But uh, once Hitler invaded Poland, the British people realized that Hitler was a true menace and a true threat. And that's when the British people began having air raid warnings, and they were just terrified the British bombers were going to appear out over the skies. And it was they were sending children to the countryside to get away from the cities, and it was just one of those things where what had once been a neat and organized and kind of ignorant populace all of a sudden was terrified. It was terrified of death from the skies, just like the people of Poland endured.
Mm-hmm. So for the people that don't know, Churchill wasn't prime minister from the beginning of the war, correct? It was Chamberlain. Could you describe Chamberlain for me? What type of figure was it?
Ultimately, he got played by Hitler. I mean, Hitler, he believed every lie that Hitler told him, and he practiced a policy of appeasement. Chamberlain was call him a tall, thin, aristocratic individual, very old school British. He tragically dies before the end of the war of stomach cancer, and like shortly after the whole book takes place. And Churchill was in his war cabinet, but at the same time, Chamberlain really kind of kept Churchill at arm's length. He was only there for political reasons. But finally, Chamberlain is forced out. Churchill is called to the palace to, May 10th, 1940, to accept the role of prime minister from the king. And which is coincidentally is the day that the Nazi Germany invaded France. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of synergy between Churchill becoming prime minister and the German attack and the ultimate German attempt to invade England.
Mm-hmm. And England then made a deal with France that'll help. And if I'm correct, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was the one who was warning Churchill for not sending too many planes, as Britain won't be able to protect itself anymore, say France loses, correct?
Yes, and France famously falls in a very short period of time. I mean, to this day, the French people endure ridicule for the way they just rolled over for Nazi Germany, and rightly so. They again, going back to World War I, they had watched the Germans struggle to come towards Paris, and for years, and they weren't able to do it. So they thought the same thing was going to happen. They thought that the capital wasn't going to fall and all those things. And the Germans just rolled right from one side of, you know how big France is. It's from one side to the other in a matter of days. I mean, literally, Rommel is one of the tank commanders, and he made it all the way to the Atlantic in a week. And so in the meantime, there were already, because the British Expeditionary Force was an ally of the French, they were stationed in France. And so when it came time, when that fight began, British fighter aircraft were engaging the Nazis, but the Nazis had much better aircraft. And so what the French wanted, they didn't want the average British aircraft. They wanted the best British aircraft. They wanted the Hurricanes and the Spitfires. And Dowding, Hugh Dowding, and to give the reader a kind of a word picture of Dowding, a very eccentric, again, very British, very stiff upper lip type, very eccentric. He believed in fairies and sprites. So for a guy who was so conformist to believe in that, I think says a lot about him. But the one thing he believed in more than anything else was air power, and in particular fighter aircraft. And he knew that if we kept giving the French, the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, Britain would have no more aircraft. Britain would have no way to defend itself. And so he wisely stood up to Churchill and said, we cannot send them any more aircraft. And Churchill reluctantly agreed.
Because there was one moment, right, that you write about in the book where Hugh Dowding actually stands up to Hitler in a meeting. correct?
No, he stands up to Churchill in a meeting.
Yeah, Churchill, sorry.
Churchill thought he was going to punch him. It was like Dowding was so upset, but all Dowding was doing was walking over and handing him a piece of paper that showed how many aircraft the British had, how many they had already lost, in to defend France, and basically what was going to happen if they continued on that path. This sealed the fate of France, but at the same time, the French people had to stand up and fight for themselves, and they did not do so.
So Churchill agreed then to not send any more planes, but eventually he did send more, correct?
Yeah, and the way he got around it was he didn't actually send them. They weren't based in France, but they were based in England, and then they would fly across the channel, which took them about 15 minutes. So, but then they would fight, then they would fly back home and spend the night and do it again the next day. So that's how he got around what he was saying, because Churchill felt very bad abandoning the French people. He knew the French generals, he knew the French leaders. He didn't want to abandon them because he felt morally that was the wrong thing to do. But at the end, he had no choice. It was just, what it came down to, after Dunkirk, when the British were still sending fighter aircraft. I say we as if I'm British. When you write a book, you live in the mindset of your characters. So for a while, I was very British. My favorite hotel in London, one time, they gave me an upgrade on my room. They put me in a nice suite, and they said, "This is for the number of times you come here." And I said, "Oh, how many times have I stayed here?" "Oh, 35 times." And I go, "I didn't realize I'd even been to London 35 times." So I go there a lot, But again, what happened after Dunkirk, after all those troops were rescued from the beaches, and including a number of fighter pilots who had been shot down and made their way to Dunkirk. After that, there was no further hope of defending France, and so that brought an end to sending aircraft over there, and that began the buildup. So Dunkirk took place at the end of May 1940. Battle of Britain began roughly 6 weeks later. The actual date is debated by historians, but that 6 week period was pivotal to rebuilding the British fighter aircraft and getting ready for the German onslaught that was sure to come.
Because the Battle of France was lost, and if I'm correct, you wrote down in your book that there was kind of like an anger towards the RAF pilots, right?
Yeah, because all the people stranded on the beach in Dunkirk and all the people who had, been pushed back to the ocean by the Germans, they couldn't see the aerial combat. They couldn't see what the RAF was doing to shoot down the Germans because it took place at 20,000 feet. That's way up in the sky, so they couldn't see them. So all they saw were the German aircraft that would come over Dunkirk and bomb and strafe, and they didn't see any, Spitfires and Hurricanes, so they assumed that the RAF wasn't doing anything to help them, when in fact the RAF was really struggling and losing a lot of men and planes.
So in the book, you take on a journey of 4 important figures, right? So you go Geoffrey Wellham, you go Richard Hillary, Billy Fisk, and Peter Townsend. Sadly, we don't really have the time to discuss all 4 of them, but I do want to get into detail about Townsend, because he was a very important figure in the whole Battle of Britain. Could you share with us whom he was?
Yeah, and real quickly, those 4 pilots, the reason I chose each of them, Geoffrey Wellham was the youngest Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot. He was just a teenager.
18, right?
Yeah, he literally went from school into flight training.
That's so weird, because I'm 21, and for me that's so weird to think about that 3 years ago I would have been fighting up in the sky.
You're the average age of a World War II fighter pilot. So 21, 22.
I just got my driver's license like 6 months ago.
Yeah. So Wellham is the youngest. Billy Fisk is an American who fought for the British. Richard Hillary I chose just because he wrote a very moving book about his experiences, but also because he suffered a horrific, I won't give it away to the readers, but just a very very bad crash. And then Townsend is the veteran pilot. He was a pilot before the war began. Everybody else became a pilot after the fighting was about to heat up. And he flew Hurricanes, and he was one of the top British fighter pilots of not just the Battle of Britain, but World War II. And I liked him as an individual because he was a very passionate man. You know, at the start of the fight, he he had this hot girlfriend who lived in, I think, Norway or someplace like that, and he's burning up the phone trying to, keep track of her before she finally ditches him. Um, but he was a great pilot. He was a great leader, and he was shot down twice during the Battle of Britain, um, in two different ways. I mean, one time he shot down 7 miles off the coast in the channel, and luckily he's picked up. The other time he parachutes out, but a cannon shell from a German Messerschmitt, tears off his big toe on his foot, and yet he still finds a way to get back in the cockpit soon after. So a very brave and heroic man, and he's very open and honest about what it's like to take a life in aerial combat, and that feeling of at first being glorious, and then just feeling a little bit repulsed, and then just kind of feeling like it's my job. If I don't kill them, they're going to kill me. And he says it in a very frank, matter of fact way that takes any of the glory, any of the, just the the shininess out of that kind of killing.
A man of duty, I would say. So the first altercation is with a Dornier 17, correct? And could you describe to us that story? Because I've read the part in your book, and I could like visualize it when I was reading it. Could you try to describe it that way too via this interview?
Well, for those who've been to northern England, they know that the coast off Yorkshire it's the sea is stormy and kind of green and angry. The weather is cold, and the clouds are leaden, and he just basically they take off because radar has picked up this incoming flight of German bombers, and he's with two other guys, and they fly low over the waves. They can stay hidden, but they find the bomber, and what follows is they shoot it down, and the plane literally trails smoke as it comes back over land, from the ocean over land. So the people are on these bluffs watching this plane come in, and the pilot managed to land it. But inside the plane, it's just carnage. People are shot up. The plane itself is just really badly damaged, and they end up crash landing. And like one of the Germans loses a leg, another one is just dead, shot up. The pilot tries to burn secret documents, but doesn't get away with it, and they're all marched off to a POW camp.
And he was able to see Townsend, right, from his cockpit.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, when we think about aircraft now, the cockpit is just is not a very big piece of glass, but back then you had these big bubbles on the nose of clear. It wasn't plastic, but it was just a kind of a mixture between plastic and glass. But you could see what was going on. You could see the men inside. You could look at your opponent. You could literally see all their features. It was really, it was kind of like medieval jousting, where you could see your opponent, close enough to touch them, but you were just never really right on top of your opponent.
And if I remember correctly, he also was able to like open up the thingy, right, and like kind of look, because it was kind of stormy at that moment.
Yeah, and that always blows my mind. Back, and again, these are not pressurized cockpits, so yeah, they slide back the canopy, and very often what they do is they'll if they can't see something, if their windscreen is covered in clouds or something like that, they'll poke their head out. And you think about it, you're going 330 miles an hour, and you're putting your head out into that thing. I mean, that must be bracing, to say the least.
Yeah, incredible. So now let's get into the Battle of Britain. So could you describe to us, so the two opponents are like the RAF and the Luftwaffe, correct? You already said it was 3-1. How prepared was England?
That's a really good question. I think they had a lot of time to prepare, but at the same time, and the biggest thing that England had in their advantage was IDF, which we now known as radar. so they could see when the Germans were coming. But what they had to do was this is all Hugh Dowding. This is his genius. They didn't they didn't launch every plane every time the Germans came over. They launched scattered groups of aircraft, and they would assemble would assemble in the sky and then go find the Germans. So they were not surprised very often because of radar, but at the same time they knew that if they sent every aircraft into the sky and suffered significant losses, they would be destroyed. So the strategy again became, they called the big wing versus the small wing theory. Big wing is every plane. Small wing is just a few flights, a few squadrons going up to take on, you think about it, maybe 8 British aircraft against 20 or 30 Germans. And that's why it was so important to have radar, so they could get altitude, they could be in the clouds, they could have the sun at their back, and they could attack from that position of superiority.
Do you think the training was also better at the RAF in comparison to the Luftwaffe?
You know what? No, the training. First of all, the German pilots lived like kings. I mean, they had the best facilities, and most of the German pilots had fought as in the Spanish Civil War, back in 1936. So they had combat experience. And so, for instance, when they invaded Poland, those pilots dropping those bombs were largely people who'd already been at war. They knew what it was like to fight in war, and they had been pilots for 4, 5, 6 years by the time the Battle of Britain came along. Whereas the British pilots, and this to me is remarkable, there's this bit of misinformation that basically they were just throwing young boys into the cockpit without any training, and then they just took off. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The British aviation pipeline to go from a non-pilot to a pilot had several steps and several different kinds of training aircraft, but not just, they didn't just learn how to fly a plane, they had to learn how to fly in formation, they had to learn to do aerobatics, they had to learn how to shoot, and all of that took time. And that was one of the great things about that phony war, that period between September 1939 and May 1940, is that all these pilots could kind of get through the pipeline and get in, finally learn how to fly a Spitfire. Probably the second or third aircraft they would fly during their training process. And what I like about that is my own son is a military pilot. The process he took to get his wings was almost the exact same process that the British used in 1940. So it works. It's a tried and true method.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. What do you think are like the key elements of the training schedule that just really works?
It's very intense. It's very intense, and people think of becoming a pilot as just getting in a cockpit, but there's significant classroom time, and they have to learn a lot of things that you wouldn't think about. You're not learning how to fly, but you're learning how to navigate, using the sun and the stars, and you're learning how to fly at different altitudes, and how to put on an oxygen mask. And there's a lot of, and it's very demanding. So you don't progress through this pipeline without several significant milestones and tests along the way. And if you don't pass the test, they just kick you out. And that was the thing. I mean, Jeffrey Wellham was the one who really obsessed about the idea that he didn't want to be kicked out, because he remembered one day he saw a guy he'd been flying with him recently, and all of a sudden the guy didn't pass the test. Next thing you know, he's out, and he saw him get in the cabin leave, and he was never going to fly again.
So the Battle of Britain was quite short. It was around 4 months, right? What do you think are like the key moments that were decisive for the victory of England?
There are several, but but you say it when you say short. When you think about 4 months, it really is short.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really intense 4 months.
Yeah, it's like 4 months of only getting like a maximum 4 hours sleep.
Yeah, some of those pilots, they'd fly 3 or 4 missions a day. So you go up in the skies, you're jacked up on adrenaline, you're in a dogfight, you land, you refuel, and you take off again right away, and that's exhausting. And by the time the battle was over, a lot of those pilots were just mentally, physically, and emotionally just shot, just well, bad pun, but really in a bad place. Significantly, the start of the battle in July, which, like I said, people still debate when the actual battle started, but
How is that possible?
what's that?
How is that possible that they debate like the start date?
Well, because there were always some manner of like German, like they'd send planes over to kind of probe stuff. There might be a little bit of combat. So, and all of a sudden, all those little miscellaneous little probes became just full on engagement, and it stopped being about British fighter pilots just protecting the coast. It became protecting everything because the Germans were attacking British shipping and the Royal Navy. Um, but then, what happened was Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that he would have, he would destroy the Royal Air Force by September 15th at the latest. And September 15th is significant because that's kind of the last week where the English Channel is calm enough for an invasion fleet to get across. After about the middle of September, the English Channel gets very, the waves get bigger, the seas get angrier, the wind is bigger. And so that was the timeline. It was like, and the British had to hold out at least until then. And so that, by the end of August, the Germans literally threw everything they had at the British. And it was just one of those days where, man after man was shot down. And if you got shot down on the channel, your chances of being found were not great. The British didn't have a life raft in their plane, so they wore a buoyancy vest. But if you got shot down, you probably were never going to be found. So it was just all of that escalated. And then, in September, the Germans stop bombing the air bases, and then they start bombing London, trying to break the will of the people, which had the opposite effect, where the British people kind of rose up and took great pride in the fact that they were going to stand up to Hitler. And then, the end of the battle itself, I mark it as September 17th, which is when Hitler ordered all of the landing craft to be pulled out of the ports and go back to their home port because there was not going to be an invasion.
Mm-hmm. What is your favorite moment of the battle?
That's a good question. I like not a particular moment. I like the moments that I highlight in the book, those personal moments where a pilot is tested or a pilot overcomes something. The story of Billy Fisk is one of my favorite parts of the book, and so much so that I would like to write a whole book about Billy Fisk. And again, I'm not going to give it away to the readers, but it's such a great story, and he's such a great larger-than-life character. So that's what I glom onto. Like you said, those four figures, the four pilots, when I think about the battle, I kind of wrote about it through their eyes, but I also, as someone who learned their stories, the battle filtered through their experiences back to me, so that when I think about the battle, I think about the things that they did.
I think it was a line in your book. You said something along the lines that with war, like people turn into statistics, something like that.
Yeah, well, it's easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy to turn people into statistics, and I think you did the opposite. You turned the statistic into a story again.
Oh, that's good. That's the way it should be, right?
Mm-hmm. Especially Billy Fisk, the way you described him, like an American wanting to go to war for a country he isn't even from. Plus, he's already wealthy too, right?
Yeah, he's got everything. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got money in the bank. He can do anything he wants. He's got 2 Olympic gold medals. I mean, he can do anything he wants with his life, and he chooses to go off and become a very good fighter pilot. I read his flight log, and actually and saw it in his own handwriting, and you can feel his enthusiasm for mastering the Hurricane, which was a very difficult aircraft, and then becoming the first when he finally begins shooting down other aircraft and really becomes a true member of the British squadron.
Are there people still like descendants of him that could help you with that book, you think?
You know, I would have to look, but if you look hard, you can always find people. That's the thing about researching is once you start poking around, you'll find somebody. It's like this guy who the lone living RAF pilot, John Hemingway, who lives in Dublin. I mean, I didn't even know who he was until I got halfway through the book, and I really want to get the guy a book is what I'm saying. So I got to dig a little bit and see if I can find him.
Did you do any one-on-one interviews in order to write the book?
Everybody's dead.
Yeah, that's true. Descendants, maybe.
Yeah. No, but that's the thing is when you research, descendants don't help, because, especially in this case, for instance, because let's say you're the daughter of a pilot. Well, none of these guys really had children, at that time, and so the ones who did have children later, the children weren't present for the battle itself. So the only thing they'd be able to offer would be a second or third hand account of what happened. So luckily for me, a lot of British fighter pilots wrote books about their experiences in the Battle of Britain. And so when you can read an account of what happened in that pilot's own handwriting, and you can see what they were thinking and their true emotions, that's great research. Really, really helps.
Yeah, to me, World War II biographies are like probably one of my favorite genres because you can really see like how they witnessed it. I just finished a one about Alistair Urquhart, his name is. Have you read that one?
No.
He's from Scotland. It's called The Forgotten Highlander. He was a prisoner on the Death Railway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, incredible story. He even got sunk in the Hell ship. He survived Hiroshima. He survived it all.
That's a great story.
Definitely recommend reading it. While doing your research, was there anything that surprised you about the Battle of Britain?
Yeah, I mean, again, let's go back to London. If you walk around London, it's been rebuilt, so you can go through certain parts of the city where you'll see that there's a very old, like, Georgian type architecture, and like right next door there's a super modern building.
Mm-hmm.
I used to think, well, like, wow, why would they tear down those cool buildings? But then you realize they were bombed. Those buildings were destroyed. And then if you look at a map of London, just a World War II map of all the bombing locations, about all the places in London that were bombed, it's amazing. It's everywhere. Those places throughout the whole city were just I mean, and it wasn't just, by the docks. It wasn't just train stations or railways. It was neighborhoods. It was, pubs and villages. It just was just amazing that all that was it just infiltrated everyday life.
That they were able to survive that too.
Can you imagine? I mean, very few people fled the city. They still had jobs, so they would get up in the morning, they would sweep the glass off the sidewalk from last night's bombing mission, and people would get on the tube and go to work.
And would everyone like sleep in a bunker, or some people just still sleep at home?
Some people stayed at home. Some people would go down to the air raid shelter. If in the Mayfair section of London, there's in Grosvenor Park, which is a beautiful area there, used to be by the American Embassy. Well, during the war, it was not a beautiful green park. It had trenches. It had barrage balloons, those balloons that were 10,000 feet in the air. And it was an anti-aircraft place. So that lovely park was once one of the ways that London defended itself, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, like I've seen a picture of London Underground during World War II once, and everyone like sleeping on the train tracks. To me, like every time I walk there now, I can just imagine that someone probably slept where I'm standing right now during World War II.
Yeah, some of those older tube stations. Like I came out of the Aldwych station one time because I was trying to retrace Jeffrey Wellham's path from the day he, received an invitation to become a fighter pilot, and he got off the tube and he took a left turn and walked out of the Air Ministry. And just to walk in his footsteps is just it's pretty cool, actually, and just do it. Think about the tube, and like we all know, if you take the tube, if you have a long tube ride, you better prepare because there are no underground toilets. And that was a problem during the war because there were no sanitary facilities. You had to kind of plan all that stuff in advance.
No showers, nothing, just a lot of rats.
You got to bring your own food. You've got to bring your own blankets. When you put people in close quarters like that, people are going to get a little bit testy. But the British people really lifted each other up and came through that in good form.
Because was the bombing mostly during the night or also during the day or both?
Well, that was one of the switches. So early in the fight, the Germans only came at daytime,
Mhm.
and so that really helped the British pilots because again, not just radar, but they could see them. And then after early September, they started bombing at night, and the the British had a really hard time finding these night bombers because it was all visual. There was no radar in the aircraft, so you had to find the plane. Well, if you've got a black sky and you've got a plane painted black, it's really hard to find it.
Mhm.
So when they switched to night bombings, that's the phase known as the Blitz. That's September 1940 to May 1941 of just nightly bombings. They bombed every night except for two.
And what was the two? Was Hitler's birthday or something? Like, why did they stop?
Yeah, they just randomly took a night off. But can you imagine? Just nuts.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking, especially what you just mentioned, is that they were still going to work. So like, okay, like if you've got like during the night, then you know, okay, I'm gonna work during the day, and then in the nighttime, I guess I'll go to the bunker. But like if it's also during the day, then how can you go to work? Or you just have to hope that it doesn't land on your shop or office.
And that's exactly what happened. Edward Murrow, the American journalist who was over there, talked about that. Walking down the street and seeing the place where he got his hair cut, all of a sudden wasn't there anymore. Little things like that. You think about it, the guy who had been his barber, someone he'd talked with and had conversations with, and who cut his hair, all of a sudden that guy is no more, and his shop is just gone, and it's that makes it personal.
One of the important figures, obviously, is Winston Churchill, but especially his speeches. I'm quite curious what your answer is going to be. So, do you think his influence on the morale of the people and the pilots and the soldier, whatever, is overrated, underrated, or correctly rated? Because Churchill gets a lot of credit.
No, very underrated.
Underrated, okay.
Yeah, because as much credit as he gets, the British, let's say that Chamberlain had still been the prime minister. And Chamberlain went on the BBC just like Churchill did. But if you listen to Chamberlain's speeches, there's a little bit of fear in them. There's a little bit of um, like he's trying to hedge his bets. And Churchill was full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes. You know, he was what the British people needed at that time. And when you think about it, we think of him as this great orator, but he had a little bit of a lisp. He had he kind of, if you listen closely, his speeches, some words you really can't understand that well because he just doesn't really make the whole word. But the power of his message, and he spent a lot of time crafting these messages. He didn't just kind of make it up as he went. He would handwrite them. He would have them typed out, and they would be written almost um, like in the Psalms. The way the Psalms are written is, most of the Psalms were originally songs and they weren't spoken. Well, his stuff is written in a way that they could have been sung.
Mhm.
So he was very, very pragmatic. During my research, I went to a couple places where he had given some of his famous speeches, and later some of them were bombed because the Germans were very aware of where they thought a lot of Churchill, and they didn't like him and they wanted him dead, so they were kind of hunting him.
So, how important do you think the morale of a soldier is? Do you think morale helps with winning battles?
I definitely think morale helps winning battles. You have time and again, I'm reading this really good oral history right now of D-Day, and you can see the enthusiasm the men had going into they were so well trained and they'd spent so much time preparing that even when all around them, all hell was breaking loose, they had a very optimistic, a very upbeat attitude. And whereas if you have a scared army, you're in deep trouble. And so yeah, I think morale is everything. And the British fighter pilots, they they were under these really hard conditions, but their morale was high, their belief in their cause was high, And again, it goes back to Churchill. Churchill, that was almost all of his governance was great, but the way he kept up the morale of the people and the soldiers and the pilots was pivotal to everything.
What is your favorite Churchill speech?
Um,
Is there a favorite?
we'll fight them on the beaches. It's that's my favorite one. And the secret behind that was he actually stole that from the Jungle Book. Kipling had used that line in I can't remember which of the Jungle Books, but had used that line, and Churchill just stole it and said, "This is mine, and it's mine forever." And I learned that. By the way, I learned that at the Churchill War Museum.
Oh, I thought you might have learned that when you're reading the Jungle Book, and yeah, I recognize it.
I've read the Jungle Book. I love it. Actually, my production company is named Mowgli because I think so much of the Jungle Book.
Okay. So besides the morale of like the soldier, Britain was also thinking about the morale of the children in a way. So they had like Queen Elizabeth do this radio broadcast with her sister, which I found fascinating because she was only 14 years old. Could you tell me something about that?
Well, sure. Her father, the king, believes strongly in public service. So even when London was getting bombed, the king did not leave London. He stayed in Buckingham Palace, and the palace itself was bombed a few times.
Mm-hmm.
He thought it was necessary for the children of Britain um, to not be afraid. And so to do that, instead of a grown man giving the speech, he let his teenage daughter give the speech. And she had been evacuated to Windsor, which is outside the city, with Margaret. But she gave this, if you listen to the speech, it's a lovely speech. You can find it on YouTube.
My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
She's very calm. She's very professional, and you can tell her dad is training her to become the queen. But it's really beautiful.
Yeah, very articulate at such a young age.
Yes.
Not stumbling over words. Like she did a really good job. And you just mentioned that King George V, right? If I'm correct, yeah. That he stayed in London. Was he ever close to like danger, or was he always in the bunkers, or how did that go?
Oh, like one time, one German pilot, I think he was in a Dornier, came straight down the mall and laid a bomb like right on top of Buckingham Palace, and it killed. And he saw the plane coming. He was with the Queen Mother at the time, and she was like looking. He had something in his eye, and she was helping him look into his eye. Next thing you know, the palace is getting bombed, and there are pictures of him the next day walking through the rubble, for the stuff. There's also a couple occasions where he visited Hugh Dowding at Fighter Command, which was another prime German target. So he was very much a hands-on king as far as being a wartime ruler.
And to get at the end of the Battle of Britain, when do we kind of decide that the battle is over? From what date and why?
Yeah, September 17th is the date that I use, and again, it's because uh, Churchill was in a meeting, a cabinet meeting, and intelligence was brought forth showing that the German invasion fleet had stood down. All the landing barges that were going to be used to invade England were sent back to their home ports, and there would be no invasion. And the thing about it is, for years afterwards, people thought Hitler might, try again but he never did try again. That was the one and only time.
In your book, you also write about what would have maybe happened if not if they lost. Like, in how far do we really like know the plans of the Nazis? Like, if the Battle of Britain was lost.
Well, you think about it, the Nazis they already had submarines off the coast of the United States, and they sank a number of ships. So it's not too far-fetched to imagine that they might have attempted an invasion. Let's put it this way: Hitler's plan was world domination. He gave the Pacific to the Japanese, so the Atlantic was his to do with what he wants. So he might have started with the Caribbean islands. He might have started with South America. He might have gone to the United States directly through Mexico. There are a number of things he could have done, but but once he had subjugated Great Britain, there was nothing to stand in his way. And, America wasn't even in the war yet. And that was one of the things Churchill kept trying to do is, pull them in. And which is why Churchill was very happy on December 7th after the Pearl Harbor attack, because he knew America had no choice but to come into the war. But Britain did truly stand alone during the Battle of Britain. I mean, that little island nation against all of the Nazi might with very little outside assistance, it was a huge, huge accomplishment.
Because you write about Directive Number 16, that Hitler administrated that. What exactly was that?
That was the full-on invasion of England. That was just like, this is what we're going to do. And, ironically, American Ambassador Joseph Kennedy was a fan of Hitler's. He thought there was no way that the British could defeat Hitler, and to the point that Roosevelt recalled him and then fired him, or well, I should say accepted his resignation, but he was very much a defeatist.
Did he ever change his mind?
That's a good question. Not that I know of. I mean, I've got a book of his letters, and he was a staunch advocate of Nazi Germany. A lot of Americans were at the time. Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford. A lot of people liked the Nazi way, the Nazi war machine.
Is it also the Kennedy from the famous Kennedy, like the President Kennedy, or different Kennedy?
No. Joseph Kennedy is the patriarch of that family. So his son, John Kennedy, was in London for a time before the battle. He was actually in Parliament during one of the debates as the war was beginning. Bobby Kennedy was 14 at the time. He was home. Their oldest son, Joe Jr., was killed in World War II when his bomber exploded.
Yeah, it's always quite funny to see, like, especially now looking back, how many people thought wrong. I'm currently making a video about Edward VIII, about his thoughts with the Nazi ideology and actually visiting Hitler too. And now we look back at him like, what were you thinking?
Well, if Hitler had successfully invaded Britain, he was going to put Edward back on the throne and to become a puppet government. So there's video of him teaching the Nazi salute to Queen Elizabeth when she was a young girl, which is a little chilling. But again, it goes back to the fact that people thought the Nazis were harmless. They thought they were nice people.
Yeah, and I also read that he thought it was kind of like a war against communism. He kind of thought, okay, Nazi ideology might not be the best, but it's better than communism, kind of.
That was a very common belief in the world at that time, because the world was much more terrified of the communist revolution, in the Soviet Union than they were of the Nazis. And they saw the Nazis as a way to counterbalance that. And so, one of the reasons Hitler didn't try to take Britain again was because he attacked the Soviet Union. So that was kind of put an end to all that.
To finish off this interview, would you mind sharing what your writing process is? Or I would rather say like research and then after that writing, because I'm quite curious, because to me it's quite fascinating that you've got like a book with, like 300, 400 pages, and you can read it in like maybe 2 weeks, a month, but you've just invested probably 2 years nearly into that.
I give every book about 6 to 8 months.
Okay.
But I'm very obsessive. So when I come up with a topic, I'll just kind of read a little bit about the overall story, and then I'll do travel. I'll go to the place and I'll kind of smell the air and walk around and go to the museums and go to the archives. And then when I start writing, I try to write chronologically in sequence. And really, whenever you tell good history, you have to put as much detail in as you can. So literally every sentence of every book is, write the sentence and then go online. Like if I say, oh, it was a warm day, well, I got to go online and make sure, and I got to look at an old newspaper to make sure it was a warm day, and what was the temperature and what were people doing. And you kind of build a story like that. And some days that means only writing 100 words, because it takes so long to research each word, each paragraph, each chapter. But then when you get the whole thing done and then you go back and massage it and you make the words pretty and you take out the clunky sentences, that's a lot of fun. And that's the final part. And I like to polish each word like right up until the minute the book goes into print. I will literally massage every page. I probably read the entire book 50 times.
Wow. And how many people do you let go over it and give you feedback?
I've got, well, my editor, obviously, I hire a copy editor who goes through things for me before I give it to the publisher. So that way, when I give it to the publisher, it should be mistake-free. And then, they have their own army of people that they go through things and that, they polish and they make suggestions or they ask questions to make anything to make the book better. That's the bottom line. It has to, my agent reads it and he's very honest. So if it's not good, he'll tell me it's not good. So stuff like that.
As my last question, I would like to know which character in the book, if it was possible, would you like to interview with yourself?
Oh, that'd be good. I'd probably actually go with Edward R. Murrow, the journalist.
I'm standing on a rooftop looking out over London.
He lived in London throughout all that stuff, and he would go out and be with Londoners, but he would also go to the beaches. He would go to the the Air Force bases. So he was everywhere. So he saw the whole thing, and he didn't just see parts of it. He saw the whole thing. He was a friend of Churchill's. I'd love to talk to him. He died very young of lung cancer. So, never got to read his stuff.
He never wrote about it either, like a book?
He did a couple books, but they weren't in his own words. They were basically his radio shows. People transcribed them and put them into a book.
Okay, that's very sad. Yeah, he probably had like the most detailed accounts too, because he's got like the eye of a journalist. So the way he would have written it down would have been just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, he did.
Very sad to hear. I want to thank you for your time. It was a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I think the people listening too. If anyone's interested in the book, it's available everywhere, correct?
You can get it on, Amazon, any place. It's hardcover, it's Kindle, there's audiobooks. The audiobook is really good. The guy who does it is a Shakespearean actor, so it has a really nice, rich tone to it. So, but thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.